The sun, a fiery anvil in the New Mexico sky, beat down on Clara Red Ash Moncrief's small homestead. Dust devils danced miniature whirlwinds across the parched earth, mimicking the uneasy currents that often stirred this unforgiving land. At just over 30, Clara carried the weariness of a woman who had seen too much too soon. The echo of Antietam still reverberated within her, a phantom limb of grief where her husband, Thomas, once stood. Now, only the soft gurgle of her newborn son, bundled in the shade of a weathered porch, offered a different kind of sound. It was 1872. The Civil War was a fresh, gaping wound, and this frontier, far from the battlefields, felt like another front in a never-ending conflict. Here, the struggle wasn't against blue or gray, but against the land itself, and the simmering tensions between the burgeoning settlements and the native tribes. For now, an uneasy truce held, a fragile peace built on mutual avoidance rather than understanding. Clara, a homesteader on the very edge of Apache and Comanche territories, understood the precariousness of this balance better than most. Her rifle, an extension of her arm, was always close. She worked her fields with a quiet, fierce determination, her hands calloused but nimble. Every seed planted, every furrow turned, was an act of defiance against despair, a testament to her resolute will to build a life from the ashes of her past. She nursed her child under the wide, indifferent sky, her maternal instinct a primal force in this raw world. Trust was a luxury one could ill afford out here, and yet Clara, beneath her hardened exterior, harbored a kindness that even the harsh realities of the frontier hadn't managed to extinguish. The air thrummed with the unseen vibrations of unacknowledged histories. The land was beautiful in its brutal honesty, rust-colored sands stretching to endless horizons, ancient rock formations standing like silent sentinels, and the constant, dry whisper of the wind carrying tales untold. It was a place of extreme beauty and extreme danger, a constant reminder that humanity was merely a fleeting presence in a landscape that had seen empires rise and fall. Clara knew this, lived it, and endured. The silence of the vast plains was a constant companion, but it was a silence poised, always, on the brink of shattering. The first slivers of dawn painted the eastern sky in bruised purples and oranges, a stark contrast to the endless, blue-gray of the pre-daylight world. Clara, roused by the faint stirrings of her infant son, was accustomed to the silent symphony of the frontier awakening. But this morning, a discordant note cut through the familiar peace. A low groan, raw and desperate, pulled her from her bedroll. She reached for the rifle propped against the rough-hewn wall, her movements fluid and practiced. Every homesteader knew the dangers that lurked in the dawn's dim light, marauders, wild animals, or worse, the shifting tides of unresolved conflicts with native bands. Stepping cautiously to the doorway, Clara peered out. Collapsed on her porch, a dark silhouette against the burgeoning light, was a man. He lay awkwardly, his frame suggesting a build she recognized from the few distant encounters she'd had with Apache warriors. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a drumbeat of primal fear. But then, a soft, almost imperceptible sound broke through the rising tension, a faint whimper, not of a man, but of a child. Next to the warrior, clutched tightly in his blood-soaked embrace, was a swaddled bundle. A tiny face, barely visible, stirred within the folds of cloth. The warrior lifted his head, his dark eyes meeting hers, full of an agony and pleading that transcended language. Blood bloomed on the rough-hewn planks beneath him, staining the wood a horrifying crimson. He was clearly gravely wounded, a cavalry bullet wound visible on his side. With a monumental effort, he rasped out 2 words, barely audible, before his eyes rolled back, and he slumped into unconsciousness. Milk. Baby. Clara's finger tightened on the trigger. Every instinct screamed at her to protect herself, her son, her isolated world from this unexpected intrusion. This was an Apache warrior, an enemy in the eyes of her people, bleeding on her porch. Yet, the infant's weak cry, so vulnerable, so utterly helpless, pierced through her fear like a needle through cloth. It was the universal sound of suffering, one that spoke not of tribes or wars, but of pure, innocent need. Her gaze dropped from the warrior's still form to the tiny, struggling bundle. Against all the warnings etched into her very being by years of frontier life and war stories, against every shred of logic, Clara lowered her rifle. The decision had been made in a heartbeat, a primal response overriding logic and fear. Clara gently placed her rifle against the doorframe, her gaze fixed on the tiny, whimpering bundle. She knew the risks. Sheltering an Apache, especially a wounded one, in this territory was an act of treason in the eyes of the cavalry. But the infant's desperate cries were a language she understood instinctively, a call for a mother's embrace. With trembling hands, she knelt beside the unconscious warrior, her eyes scanning for any sign of deception. His breathing was shallow, ragged, and the blood loss was severe enough that she doubted he posed an immediate threat. Cautiously, Clara reached for the swaddled child. The infant was alarmingly thin, its skin dry and paper-like, its small mouth open, issuing weak protests. Clara settled onto the porch, pulling the baby gently to her breast. The touch was alien, yet familiar. The small mouth latched on with surprising strength, a hungry suckling that sent a jolt through her. A profound sense of purpose, raw and undeniable, filled her. This was not just a strange baby. It was a life, fragile and dependent, in her hands. As the infant quieted, its tiny body relaxing against hers, Clara felt something shift within her. The deep, buried grief for her lost husband, the constant vigilance and weary independence, momentarily receded, replaced by an urgent, overwhelming wave of maternal instinct. Her own son, still sleeping peacefully within the house, seemed to stir in her thoughts. How could she turn away a child, any child, from the sustenance of life? This was not about white man or Apache, border or treaty. This was about sustenance, survival, and the unspoken bond between mother and child. She glanced at Taza, the warrior. He lay motionless, a silent testament to the brutal realities of this frontier. She had to move them both. If he or his men found an Apache, wounded or not, on her land, there would be no questions, only consequences. The first rays of sunlight now bathed the porch, illuminating the stark tableau. A white woman, an Apache warrior, and two infants, one a stranger at her breast. The act was a silent rebellion, a defiance against the hatred and division that defined their world. The first order of business was hiding them. With the Apache infant, Clara decided to call him Little Sky. For now fed and quiet, Clara meticulously cleaned the blood from her porch. Every stain was a telltale mark, a danger. Then, with surprising strength fueled by adrenaline, she dragged the still unconscious Taza to the root cellar. Its musty confines, usually reserved for potatoes and preserves, would have to serve as his sanctuary. She laid him gently on some sacking, tending to his wound with what little medical knowledge she possessed, cleaning and binding it tightly. Little Sky was settled on a makeshift bed beside him, Clara's heart clenching with each tiny, fragile breath. The silence of the cellar was oppressive, broken only by the steady drip of water from a crack in the stone wall and the faint cooing of the two infants. Clara moved between her own son's crib and the cellar, a constant ballet of fear and duty. Her mind reeled with the implications of her actions. What would her neighbors say? Widow Annie Cray, her closest and only real neighbor, already eyed her with suspicion, a thin veneer of civility barely masking deeper prejudices. And Pastor Elijah Bain, for all his talk of peace, was a Southerner, his sermons often laced with subtle warnings about the savages beyond the settlements. Adding to her monumental task, Clara's own son began to develop a fever, his small body listless and his cries weak. The burden doubled. Now she had to split her dwindling energy and her maternal care, nursing one child while fearing for the other, her internal conflict raging. Duty bound her to the wounded warrior and his child, but her heart ached for her own ailing boy. The arrival of Captain Ellis Grant and his cavalry patrol only heightened the tension. Their thunderous hooves on the dry earth approaching the homestead sent a jolt of ice through Clara's veins. Clara met his gaze with a practiced blankness, lying easily about seeing nothing unusual. He lingered, his hawkish eyes sweeping her property, a palpable atmosphere of menace emanating from him and his men. She could feel his skepticism, a chilling premonition of the danger to come. As the days blended into a relentless cycle of tending, hiding, and fearing, the land itself seemed to conspire against her. A furious sandstorm descended, a swirling vortex of grit and wind that threatened to bury her homestead and kill the fragile infants. Clara huddled in the cellar, shielding both children, praying against the elements. A few days later, a rattlesnake appeared in her own son's crib, forcing a terrifying confrontation. Life on the frontier was a constant test of endurance, and with Taza and little Sky hidden in her cellar, Clara's trials intensified. Every creak of the house, every distant hoofbeat, sent a jolt of terror through her. But the immediate threats didn't just come from men. Nature, as always, proved equally unforgiving. One blistering afternoon, the sky turned a menacing ochre. The wind began to howl, a low, mournful sound escalating into a furious shriek. A sandstorm, violent and blinding, descended upon the homestead. Clara, with both infants clutched to her chest, retreated to the cellar. The air grew thick with abrasive grit, attempting to seep through every crack and crevice. Outside, Dusty, her hardy Mustang, whinnied restlessly, pulling at his tether, instinctively seeking shelter from the onslaught. Inside, the world became a claustrophobic, dust-choked void. Clara pressed the infants' faces into her chest, shielding them, her own lungs burning with the fine particles. Little Sky, already weak, coughed raggedly, his small body trembling. It was a terrifying hour, a vivid reminder that her control over their survival was tenuous at best. When the storm finally subsided, leaving a desolate, sand-scoured landscape in its wake, Clara emerged, weary but resolute. Yet, the respite was brief. The very next morning, a chilling discovery awaited her. As she went to check on her own son, a telltale rattle cut through the pre-dawn quiet. Coiled in the corner of his crib, its diamond-patterned skin a nightmare against the pale blankets, was a rattlesnake. Clara froze, her breath catching in her throat. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Her child stirred, a soft whimper. Instinct took over. With a swift, decisive movement, she grabbed a broom leaning nearby and brought it down with all her might, crushing the venomous creature's head. The immediate danger was averted, but the incident left her shaken, a cold dread washing over her. The land itself seemed to conspire against the fragile lives under her care. Beyond these tangible threats, the cultural chasm between Clara and Taza remained wide. Taza, weakened by his wound, spoke little English. Clara knew only a few scattered words of Apache. Communication often relied on gestures, strained silences, and the shared burden of keeping the children alive. Trust was not given freely on the frontier, especially not across such deep divides. It was earned slowly, in the quiet moments of shared fear, in the silent exchange of glances, in the simple, profound acts of care as Clara tended to the warrior's wound and ensured little Sky was fed. The fever that had gripped Clara's son finally broke, leaving him weak but on the mend. Simultaneously, Taza, slowly recovering from his grievous wound, began to stir more purposefully. The acute desperation of their situation had reached its peak, and in the quiet moments that followed, a profound shift occurred. Clara, exhausted but relieved, found herself sitting by the flickering lamplight, her husband Thomas's worn leather-bound war diary in her hands. She rarely opened it, the memories too raw. But tonight, searching for some solace, her eyes fell upon a faded entry. Thomas, writing from a muddy battlefield, had described a moment of unexpected humanity, a Union soldier offering water to a dying Confederate. The words resonated deep within Clara. Her actions, born of instinct, now solidified into conviction. She wasn't just hiding a man and a child out of compassion. She was protecting them, becoming a mother and a guardian to both, a deliberate act of defiance against the cruelty that defined their world. It was during these quiet evenings, as Taza grew stronger, that the impossible began to unfold. His eyes, though still haunted, held a new depth when he looked at her, at little Skye, at her own child. He'd gesture, point, and slowly a few more English words emerged. Not enough for conversation, but enough for understanding. One evening, with a low guttural sound, Taza pointed to little Skye, then mimed a burning fire and pointed to his own chest, indicating great loss. He spoke of soldiers, not like Grant's troops, but still a massacre. Their camp, his people, burned to the ground, all but him and the tiny infant, the last direct descendant of their chief. His people were gone. His gaze hardened then, sweeping towards the window, beyond the walls, into the night where the cavalry rode. His sorrow turned into a fierce, righteous anger. He would retaliate. He would avenge his fallen people. Clara, understanding the raw, primal urge driving him, counted him. No, Taza. Hatred. War. That finishes them. The child, little Skye. He watches. He needs peace. Survival. She gestured to her own son, then to little Skye, then circled them both. Brothers. The words hung heavy in the air. Taza looked from Clara to the two sleeping infants, then back to Clara's unwavering gaze. The fire in his eyes slowly dimmed, replaced by a profound weariness. His shoulders slumped. Survival, not retaliation. The decision was made. The air crackled with unspoken tension. Taza, his fury still barely contained, watched Clara. His people had been murdered, their way of life scorched from the earth by the very men who now rode in the distance. Vengeance burned deep in his warrior's soul, a sacred duty. But Clara's words, quiet yet firm, had pierced through the haze of his rage. Little Skye. He watches. He needs peace. The decision to protect both children, born of a desperate kindness, had blossomed into an unshakable conviction for Clara. She stood between Taza and the path of destruction, a guardian not just of lives, but of a different future. Then, inevitably, the thundering hooves grew louder. Cavalry straight to Clara's homestead. They dismounted with a clatter of sabers and a chilling efficiency fanning out around the small cabin. Grant, his eyes like chipped flint, dismounted directly in front of the porch. He barked, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to absolute obedience. We have received reports of Apache activity in this sector. Clara stepped forward, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, but her face composed. She held little Skye to her chest, the infant softly suckling at her breast, utterly oblivious to the drama unfolding before him. He was a symbol, an undeniable truth. Grant's eyes narrowed, falling upon the dark-skinned infant. His face, already harsh, contorted with a mixture of rage and revulsion. He spat, pointing a gauntleted finger. An Apache whelp? Hand him over, woman. From the shadows of the doorway, Taza appeared. He moved with the quiet grace of a predator, a makeshift bow now nocked with an arrow. His gaze locked onto Grant, a promise of swift death in his eyes. Clara, hearing the subtle scrape of Taza's bowstring, knew this was the moment. She stepped forward, placing herself squarely between Taza and the soldiers, little Skye still at her breast. Her voice, though it trembled, held an unwavering defiance that cut through the silence. She challenged, her gaze sweeping across Grant's face, then to the soldiers, then beyond them towards the faint dust trails of approaching townsfolk, drawn by the commotion. Captain, you propose to execute a nursing mother? A collective gasp swept through the small crowd gathering at the edge of her property. Annie Cragg, who had arrived with Pastor Bain, stared, her jaw dropping. Grant faltered, his face flushing with fury and a sudden, unwelcome awareness of the burgeoning audience. This was not the quick, brutal execution he preferred. This was a public spectacle, and the optics, even on the distant frontier, were damning. The line between enforcing order and committing outright atrocity blurred under the public gaze. The Mexican standoff solidified the tension. Captain Grant and his men had their rifles raised, fingers poised over triggers. Less than 10 feet away, Taza stood resolute, arrow nocked, aimed directly at Grant's heart. Between them, Clara, holding Little Sky, was the unlikely fulcrum of this explosive confrontation. The dust-strewn yard had become an arena, the homestead, an unlikely battlefield where ideologies clashed. What Grant hadn't accounted for was the growing crowd of townsfolk, arriving not as an armed posse, but as witnesses. Their presence chipped away at his control, transforming his private campaign into a public spectacle. Then, the unexpected. Widow Annie Cry, a woman known for her sharp tongue and even sharper prejudice against the natives, pushed her way to the front of the gathering. Her face was grim, but her voice, though strained, was clear. She called out, her gaze fixed on Clara. "This woman, she means only to do what's right." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Pastor Elijah Bain, his usual cautious demeanor replaced by a look of profound unease, stepped forward as well. "Surely, Captain," he intoned, his southern drawl more pronounced than usual. "We are a Christian community." The collective weight of their disapproval pressed down on Grant. The idea of outright executing a white woman, a homesteader, a nursing mother, in full view of her community for harboring an infant was beyond even his ruthless code. The backlash would be severe, jeopardizing his command and his career. His face was a mask of furious calculation, his eyes burning with frustrated malice. He lowered his rifle, slowly, grudgingly. His men followed suit, though their glares remained unwavering. The treaty's dead, Grant spat, his voice a low growl, directed solely at Clara. "Protecting him now, Mrs. Moncrief, makes you one of them. Remember that." He spun on his heel, motioning to his men. As Grant turned to leave, Taza's bowstring tightened. His eyes, fixed on the captain's retreating back, gleamed with the promise of vengeance. This was his chance, a clean shot. The deep-seated fury stirred again, a final, powerful surge for retribution. But then he saw Clara's eyes. Calm, steadfast, choosing peace, choosing life. He held the bow, trembling, his arm a coiled spring of lethal intent. Then, with a profound shift in his spirit, he slowly, deliberately lowered it. He would choose Clara's path. The mounted cavalry withdrew, their anger a tangible force, leaving a bewildered mix of relief and unease in their wake. Captain Grant's parting shot, "Protecting him now makes you one of them," hung heavy in the air, a prophecy or a threat, Clara knew not which. But the immediate danger had passed, diffused not by firearms, but by an infant and a mother's fierce courage, bolstered by an unexpected display of communal conscience. Annie Cray and Pastor Bain, along with a few other townsfolk, approached hesitantly, their expressions a mix of curiosity, discomfort, and newfound respect. The community, once indifferent or hostile, had witnessed something that evening that began to chip away at their long-held prejudices. Later, in the quiet of her home, Taza spoke, his English still halting, but filled with gratitude. He would leave. He had to. His duty now was not vengeance, but to find the scattered remnants of his people, those exiles who roamed the vast, unforgiving lands like ghosts. He would guide them, protect them, and seek a new path, a path of peace inspired by Clara's courage. Little Sky, however, would remain. He was too young for the dangers of the trail, and in Clara's embrace, Taza saw a future for the last son of his chief that transcended the cycle of hatred and war. Clara, looking at the two small bundles sleeping peacefully, one fair-haired, the other dark, felt a profound acceptance settle over her. Little Sky would be raised alongside her own son, brothers in all but blood. She would nurture them both, giving them not just physical sustenance, but the milk of peace, a foundation built on understanding and compassion. Perhaps, through them, a different world could be forged, one where the colors of skin and the whispers of different languages ceased to be barriers and became, instead, threads in a richer tapestry. The parting was simple, yet profound. Taza, a warrior reshaped by mercy, stood tall. He clasped Clara's hand, a silent acknowledgement of their shared purpose. Then, with a nod to little Sky, sleeping soundly in Clara's arms, he melted back into the vast New Mexico night, a shadow swallowed by the starlight. The homestead, once a lonely outpost of survival, began to transform. The townsfolk, though still cautious, approached with less suspicion, some offering help, others simply seeking to understand the woman who had defied an army captain for an Apache child. The Rio Hondo Basin, site of so much conflict, began to whisper a new tale. Out in the Rio winds, they still whisper a tale of a woman stranger than any legend, who tamed hatred, not with rifle or fire, but with milk, courage, and the furious love of a mother. The sun dipped below the rugged western horizon, painting the New Mexico sky in hues of orange and violent red, a fitting backdrop for the day's drama. Taza, a stoic silhouette against the fading light, stood on the rise overlooking Clara's homestead. He had healed, physically, but the scars of his people's torment ran deep. Yet, in the quiet strength of Clara's defiance and the innocence of little Sky, he had found a new direction beyond bitter vengeance. Clara, holding both her son and little Sky in her arms, met him there. The air was thick with unspoken words, a profound understanding passing between them. Taza spoke, his voice low. "My path is to gather the scattered, to find a new place." He looked at little Sky, nestled against Clara's shoulder. "He stays here, with you." Clara nodded, her eyes glistening. She understood the weight of his decision, the sacrifice. "He will know his people," she promised, her gaze sweeping towards the vast, darkening landscape. With a solemn nod, Taza turned. He looked back once, a final lingering glance at the two children, then at Clara. Then he melted into the deepening twilight. He was a silent echo of the wind, a warrior choosing a path forged in resilience rather than retaliation, carrying the hopes of a fragmented people on his shoulders. Life on the homestead slowly began to normalize, yet nothing was truly the same. The town, once quick to judge, now viewed Clara with a new, grudging respect, even admiration. The image of her defying Captain Grant, an Apache infant at her breast, became a legend whispered at the general store and in the church pews. Annie Christ started bringing Clara preserves, her initial distrust softening into something akin to friendship. Pastor Bain, wrestling with his own conscience, found new depth in his sermons of universal love and human dignity. The once indifferent community began to shift, a tiny crack appearing in the hardened shell of prejudice that had long defined the frontier. Clara raised both boys, brothers in all but blood, under the vast, ancient sky. Her challenges remained, but now she faced them not alone, but buttressed by an emerging network of allies and an inner strength that burned brighter than any prejudice. Out in the Rio winds, they still whisper a tale of a woman stranger than any legend, who tamed hatred, not with rifle or fire, but with milk, courage, and the furious love of a mother. Little Sky would grow to walk in both worlds, Apache and settler, carrying the legacy not of war, but of healing.